The housing market is in shambles. In the US alone, 70% of people who want to buy a home can't even afford to anymore. In the UK, home affordability is at its worst point since the 19th century, and it's not hard to see why. In just 2 generations, house prices have doubled relative to inflation, whilst wages have stagnated below the inflation line. Mortgage rates have also climbed significantly in recent months to 6.7%, pushing homeownership further into the realm of fantasy. And if that's not bad enough, people who don't own homes are being squeezed for every last penny by skyrocketing rents. Rents that are expected to go up by over 8% this year on average. And it's even worse in the big cities. That's why in San Francisco, you can now rent a bed in a dorm room for the low price of $1,200 a month. Not a flat, not even a room, just a bed. That's why you can rent a cupboard under the stairs for literally 500 quid a month in London. Add in all the other pressures of the cost of living crisis and you get a recipe for disaster. But this isn't just the product of historical trends and generational economic pressures. The problem has been made measurably worse by a small collection of companies. A collection of companies you may never have heard of. Companies like Vanguard, Blackstone, the UBS Group, and BlackRock. By buying up $60 billion worth of the housing market, they've brought the entire system to the brink of collapse. And here's exactly how they did it. You see, right now, Wall Street is getting deep into single-family homes. Companies like Vanguard and BlackRock oversee trillions of dollars on behalf of their clients, putting it wherever they think will make the most money. And one of these is the housing market. Using their immense purchasing power, these trillion-dollar companies have the ability to price out regular people with ease, sometimes offering 50% over the asking price just hours after the houses are being listed. In 2022, nearly a quarter of the homes put on the market weren't bought by the families that needed them, but instead by institutional investors. That's nearly double the 12% it was last year. However, 15 years ago, this wasn't happening at all. With very few exceptions, Wall Street stayed entirely separate from these homes. Instead, they bet their billions on mortgage bonds, financial products that gave returns based on regular people paying their mortgages. So then what changed here? What happened? Well, it all started when the bank's beloved mortgage bonds dropped sharply in value after a housing market crash, putting the whole world into a financial crisis. You see, because the banks had leveraged so much money on housing going up, it was catastrophic when they didn't. Some of the world's biggest banks like Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers went straight into the ground, with government bailouts eventually costing taxpayers billions. And this disaster sent ripples throughout the entire global economy, leading to one of the biggest economic crashes in modern history.
It was the worst day on Wall Street since the crash of 1987.
From the financial capital of the world, the opening bell is going to ring in 5 seconds, and to be honest with you, we wish it wouldn't.
Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of families lost their homes in carnage over the next few years as housing prices continued to fall. But Wall Street, who were almost entirely to blame for the crisis, saw an opportunity. One company that made their name from the crisis was BlackRock. You see, BlackRock was hired by the US government to oversee massive amounts of money and assets that were left behind by the crisis. Using this money and the connections they brought with them, BlackRock became a multi-trillion-dollar giant. Other companies went down a different path. Instead of putting money into mortgage bonds and profiting from the housing market that way, they could make a fortune by buying the houses outright. After all, the massive amount of foreclosures meant that tons of homes were being sold cheap and there still wasn't enough demand. More houses being bought would give a stagnant housing market the boost it needed. So the government stepped in and offered these institutional investors a way to fill the gap, giving them almost exclusive access to hundreds of thousands of foreclosed homes. Some of these were sold for as little as $50,000 or $60,000, but most hovered around the $100,000 to $150,000 range. And years later, this would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. Lots of the first homes that were under the hammer were dilapidated and needed expensive renovations before people could feasibly live in them. The idea was that companies that bought them would get them up to spec then lease them to families in need. Over time, the families could put more money into buying back the home, eventually leading to homeownership. However, the flaw in the plan was trusting that all the Wall Street investors weren't going to abuse the system, like they did just a few years before. And once the floodgates were open, billions in Wall Street money went towards buying these foreclosed homes. And so within a period of 6 years, $36 billion of Wall Street money went into buying over 200,000 foreclosed homes. Immediately, a new financial industry sprung up overnight. Thousands of companies were created to take advantage of the gold rush, buying up these cheap houses thousands at a time. The largest was a company called Invitation Homes, who owned over 80,000 single-family homes at their height, eventually being incorporated into Blackstone, an investment giant with nearly $1 trillion of assets assets under their control. But what was there to be gained? Well, whilst the tenants covered the actual mortgage costs, these Wall Street companies made money on the actual value of the house. Just a few short years later, and a bounce back in house prices made these already discounted investments incredibly profitable. What's more, the homes could be used as equity to secure loans, letting these companies gain millions more to invest in whatever they wanted. This would often end up being more single-family homes, unsurprisingly. However, one problem was immediately apparent to anyone who ended up renting these homes. These massive financial companies were awful landlords. The days of an understanding and beneficial relationship between two local people were gone. Instead, the victims of the crash were often left paying rent on houses they used to own to a mishmash of shell companies and firms that were located hundreds of thousands of miles away. Then when they bought the homes, the bare minimum in repair and renovation costs was paid. As long as they were presentable at the first viewing, it really didn't matter what the long-term problems were. Although a few years later, and the returns were drying up as the market stabilized, and this meant that the companies who now own the houses needed to cut their costs in other ways. And so this would involve firing some of the support staff, increasing rents by a predatory amount, and pushing more responsibilities onto renters. Things that used to be the landlord's responsibility, like repairs and keeping the house livable, were suddenly added to new contracts. If the renters didn't sign, then they were often evicted. And the bottom line is that this was a huge shift of capital from regular working people to Wall Street millionaires and billionaires. And it was only just getting started. While these problems have continued to this day, the real value from single-family homes comes from their value as financial assets. One way which the Wall Street investors could make buckets of money was by using the homes to interfere with the housing market. Not on a global level, at least not yet. Instead, firms made sure that when they bought houses in bulk, they were all in the same place. This way, single entities could gain massive influence on the housing market in any given area, allowing them to easily jack up rents and costs. Then, a few years later, they could sell the houses at an inflated price and pocket the difference. Some cities were hit particularly hard. In August 2012, investors bought nearly 40% of all the houses on sale in Phoenix, which inevitably meant that house prices went up by 34% a few months later, pricing out all the regular people who would have bought the houses, whilst creating more crooked and exploitive rentals. And unfortunately, the story hasn't changed much today. The only difference is the scale and the fact that they aren't foreclosed properties anymore. Now Wall Street has moved into the general market, and we've already mentioned Blackstone, but they're just one of the premier firms involved in this grim business. A large part of their dollars in managed assets is tied up in housing and single-family homes. In 2021, they signed a $6 billion deal to acquire a company called Home Partners of America, which owns over 17,000 homes. However, the largest company still dealing in single-family homes is Invitation Homes, who, as I mentioned, own over 80,000 homes. And then when you follow this money, you start to look into who actually owns these companies. Well, it turns out that Vanguard and BlackRock have the biggest ownership stakes in these companies. In fact, BlackRock even bought a further $7.3 million worth of shares as recently as the end of 2022. This may be surprising considering BlackRock has made a specific announcement that they don't own single-family homes and aren't actually involved in that business at all, and yet they still own one of the largest shares in a company that does own over 80,000 homes. They are backing these massive companies buying up the homes. And what's even stranger is the sheer amount of different news articles setting out to absolve BlackRock specifically. One Vox article titled "Wall Street isn't to blame for the housing market chaos" goes into great detail on how BlackRock are just completely innocent, all while ignoring their public investments into the industry. They're the fuel under the fire. Instead, they blame local governments and regular homeowners for this crisis. The Atlantic also ran an article saying generally the same thing, giving it the subtle title "BlackRock is not ruining the US housing market." And there's so many more, all pushing the same message that it's your neighbors that are to blame, not the trillion-dollar company infamous for corrupting the market. And then the picture becomes even clearer when you find out who funds and owns these media companies. The largest shareholder in Vox is NBC Universal, which are themselves owned by Comcast, and the two largest shareholders of Comcast, well, Vanguard and BlackRock. Their combined shares in Comcast are worth around $25 billion. The Atlantic, on the other hand, is published by a company called Atlantic Media, which is mostly owned by Lauren Powell Jobs, the widow of Steve Jobs. Now, she's one of the richest billionaires in the world, and even worked in investment banks early on in her career, and so it's really not hard to guess where her allegiances lie, and why so many Atlantic articles rush to BlackRock's defense, because they can't have the masses and public waking up to the fact that their entire housing market is being bought out from under them. They can't let the public know that these massive trillion-dollar Wall Street companies are the reason that you will never afford a home, as this could very potentially hurt their corporate overlords' profit margins. Unfortunately though, buying out people's homes is just a small part of BlackRock's unimaginably huge portfolio of investments. In 2022, nearly a quarter of the homes put on the market weren't bought by families that needed them, but instead by institutional investors. That's nearly double the 12% it was last year, and all of this turmoil culminated with news that terrified markets. One of the most advanced mathematical models in the world now predicts a 98% chance of recession. Of course, with this announcement, nearly every major stock went down, bringing the S&P 500's losses to around 3% for that month, and around 23% from their peak, leaving us all asking, wait, I'm diversified, why is my portfolio still getting wiped out? Because according to the biggest firms in the world, we're not diversified in the right way. See, Goldman Sachs just released a shocking report, saying the classic stock bond strategy won't be enough to keep investors afloat, as it's already lost an average 25% last year. As a result, Goldman says the ideal allocation for stocks has shrunk from 60% to around 45%. So what do they recommend you do with that difference in order to salvage your stolen returns? Invest in real assets like art. Goldman says it can protect your purchasing power even in times like these, and data shows that the last time inflation was this high, contemporary art appreciated more than even real estate, at an average of 20% per year. And so you're thinking, that's great, but how do I invest in art? Well, with Masterworks. It's a unique platform that lets you invest in contemporary art by legends like Picasso and Banksy, but just for a fraction of the full price. So when they sell a painting you're invested in, you see a share of the potential profits. So far, Masterworks has had 11 exits, the last 3 returning 10, 13, and 35% net to investors, including thousands of Moon subscribers. As a result, Masterworks' offerings have sold out in under an hour, and there is a waitlist, but you can skip it by clicking the link in the description below. BlackRock manages trillions in assets for their clients, which are mostly other Wall Street banks and pension funds. With these trillions, BlackRock, Vanguard, and others have bought a large chunk of the world's economy, owning huge shares in Apple, Facebook, Nike, General Electric, Fox, Disney, Microsoft, Paramount, IBM, Tesla, and Google. And the list just goes on and on and on. BlackRock and Vanguard have a stake in all levels of society. And regardless of all the other problems that comes with this massive amount of control, studies have shown that competing companies having a shared ownership is toxic to their industry, and the inevitable conclusion that comes with it results in higher prices whilst quality and quantity of goods and services falls. Articles defending these practices often point to the fact that BlackRock is only overseeing other people's money, and that it's their clients that own all of this wealth. But this is a very clever way of misdirecting valid criticism, which is made all too clear when you look at where BlackRock's $8.5 trillion under management comes from. The vast majority of BlackRock's assets come from investments from other massive Wall Street financial companies. 72% of their assets are managed on behalf of other financial institutions, and insurance companies claim another 20%, leaving just 8% of their assets being owned by companies in other industries. And an even smaller proportion of this 8% comes from regular people and small businesses. I mean, it's not an over-exaggeration to say that BlackRock is Wall Street. So even though BlackRock says it's their clients which own the assets, their clients are nearly always just other massive banks or companies. And by putting their money in BlackRock's hands, they place this into the care of a loyal and trustworthy representative, as they know BlackRock will act in their interest because BlackRock's survival is dependent on their money. But why is BlackRock in such a powerful position on Wall Street? Why are they able to have so much leverage over the world's economy? Well, Aladdin is the ace up BlackRock's sleeve, and it's what separates them from the competition. Now, Aladdin is a computer software first created in 1998. It was a primitive program designed to predict the future of the stock market and what investments are most likely to be profitable. But after 25 years of tinkering, improvements, and technological progress, it's turned into an absolute monster. It represents the state of art in AI and algorithmic technology, and by studying countless terabytes of data, Aladdin's main goal is to read the future. And its financial predictions and assessments are really scarily accurate. So accurate, in fact, that over the course of 2020, Aladdin was trusted to manage over $21 trillion. Now, Wall Street and the major banks are profiting off this technology enormously, and every time someone uses this technology, this then goes back to BlackRock themselves, who charge fees for every penny that Aladdin handles. But what Aladdin really represents is the technocrat ideal of being able to control risk and the future. Every line of code in Aladdin is aligned towards the ultimate goal of averting and avoiding risk. By analyzing the past, Aladdin can keep the system running in perpetuity. And this is another reason that Wall Street and the financial world at large is so enamored with Aladdin. Its job is to keep the system which has made them all so rich completely intact. So any money they put into Aladdin only furthers this cause. It's a positive feedback loop, and it's growing exponentially. For example, in 2013, Aladdin controlled 7% of the world's financial assets, but today this has more than doubled. And if money equals power, then Aladdin represents the most powerful entity the world has ever seen. And Aladdin is only the puppet of BlackRock. BlackRock is the one overseeing all of this power. They're the ones with control over all of this money. And again, the media establishments partially owned by BlackRock are quick to point out the fact that it's BlackRock's clients that actually hold the power. But BlackRock themselves have admitted that they control all of the decisions and weights behind investments. Now legally, BlackRock has full control over the influence their investments have, despite the fact that they're not technically owned by BlackRock. And because BlackRock shares in companies are so large, they often get a seat on executive boards and a large share of voting power. And behind the doors, BlackRock and other companies like them have untold influence on the decisions of the largest companies. And the soft power that BlackRock has is immense. I mean, Larry Fink, the founder and CEO of the company, is always regularly brushing arms with world leaders. He attends the G20 meetings, where he recently just gave a speech to world leaders, and regularly holds one-to-one meetings with presidents like Emmanuel Macron. And BlackRock particularly has huge influence over the US government. Ever since the US government gave BlackRock complete control of the assets that came out of the financial crash in 2008, there's always been a very special relationship between the two entities. I mean, all the presidents have consulted with Larry Fink on financial matters, with BlackRock executives gaining hugely powerful government positions, like Brian Deasy, a former BlackRock executive that now leads Biden's National Economic Council. I mean, the US government has so many ex-BlackRock employees that they might as well just be another one of their investments. And this is also that BlackRock can maintain their immense power and keep the status quo in check. But in fact, this has been going a step too far in recent years, as BlackRock in classic fashion has quantified their own political agenda into an investment rating metric, where they give each company a quote ESG score based on sustainability and other humanitarian concerns. The only problem is that it's all just greenwashing. I mean, despite these noble claims of helping humanity, BlackRock is still heavily invested in fossil fuels and other companies that run completely opposite to their broadcasters' ideals. They don't mind funding sweatshops in China, as long as their investments in Nike and Apple continue to be profitable. And yet on the surface, they push the environmentalist agenda hard. And it's in this way that BlackRock represents the entire corporate ideology of empty activism. By saying the right things and enforcing their own political policies, BlackRock can pretend to be a force for good in the world, all whilst doing nothing to actually help society.
We're one of the fastest growing companies related to decarbonization.
In fact, they only condemn companies and cancel companies that don't follow their political agenda. But nowadays, people are waking up to this. More and more, we see more criticism of BlackRock and their influence in the entire global economy. And when it comes to things like owning a house, people are starting to realize that the main enemy in America is BlackRock. And this is probably one of the only good signs for the future, because despite BlackRock spying off the media, more and more people are becoming aware of BlackRock's insidious business plan. However, considering that a large part of BlackRock's business is based on avoiding risks and disaster, it's likely that they're here to stay, all whilst they collude with the World Economic Forum and government leaders, whilst you stay poorer because of it.